I had a bad feeling about my own house, so I pretended I was leaving on vacation. While I was watching from a distance, an elderly neighbor took my hand and said, "At midnight you'll see everything and understand it all." When midnight came, I passed out from what I saw. This story is based on real events. Friends, write where you're from and how old you are. It's really interesting to know who's watching. Enjoy listening. Inside my own house, I was hit by a heavy, sticky anxiety, almost physical, the kind that makes everything inside go cold even when it's blazing hot outside. I pretended I was going on a trip to the mountains, packed a suitcase, said goodbye to my son and daughter-in-law, got into the car, and made it look like I drove off, but instead, I stayed nearby, watching from a distance. And when one of my elderly neighbors took my hand and quietly said that by midnight I would see everything and finally understand, I had no idea how right she was. So right that when the truth stood before me in full, I would simply lose consciousness, because the world I had been living in would turn upside down. The heat that day clung to my shirt like a second skin. When I pushed open the door to my study, my fingers automatically reached for the light switch, but my hand froze halfway. Something was wrong. Nothing dramatic. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no signs of a break-in. But after living in this house near Miami for more than 40 years and serving 30 years as a district court judge, I knew every corner, every shadow, every detail of that room. My eyes immediately caught the inconsistencies, things that might have made an ordinary person twitch an eye, but for me, simply made my breathing speed up slightly. The thick yellow cardboard folders on the desk weren't where I'd left them. Not by much, just a couple of centimeters, but shifted to the left. The chair was at a different angle. And on the metal personal cabinet, my personal cabinet, which was always locked, there were fresh scratches around the lock. Thin, but very telling, like from a clumsy attempt to pry it open with a knife or something like an old metal letter opener. My heart dropped, and then started pounding as if it were trying to break through my ribs from the inside. I set the bottle of water on the desk with deliberate care, even though my first instinct was to yank the cabinet open, turn everything upside down, and find whoever had dared to invade my life. But decades on the bench had trained me to look and remember first, and only then act. So I walked slowly around the desk, giving my eyes time to note every small change. The folder with the house documents, which I always turned so it faced me, was now slightly crooked. The stack of tax papers that I had kept in perfect chronological order for years was mixed up. It was clear someone had gone through them, not just rummaging, but methodically sorting through them, then trying to put them back, though not the way they had been. I crouched down in front of the cabinet, my knees cracked in protest. Up close, the lock was covered in a web of tiny scratches, as if someone had picked at it with whatever they had on hand, pried at it, tested it. Sloppy work, but persistent. I opened the cabinet with my key. Everything seemed to be in place, but not the way I'd left it. The will was under the insurance policies instead of on top, like always. The financial reports were shifted. On the margins of a couple of pages were greasy thumbprints, slightly smudged, as if the person had been nervous while flipping through them. I caught myself trying to explain it away with age, that maybe I'd moved things myself and forgotten. After all, I'm 67. But even as the thought formed, I dismissed it. 30 years in a courtroom taught me one simple thing. Don't believe convenient explanations, believe facts. Memory can fail, moods can swing, but the order you've kept for decades doesn't just disappear on its own. I stood in the middle of my study, holding a folder with someone else's fingerprints on it, and felt something inside me slowly shift. It wasn't panic. No. It was something cold, heavy, and very familiar. That same inner predator's chill that for years had helped me spot liars, sense falsehood in polished testimony, and notice inconsistencies in perfectly prepared documents. That instinct was now screaming that something didn't add up, that someone else, someone who didn't belong, had been going through my papers. There was only one question: who? And that evening itself gave me the first answer, without words. At dinner, I sat as usual at the head of the table, facing the window to the yard. Jason took the chair on my right. His wife Allison sat across from me. The chicken was overcooked. Allison had never quite mastered my late wife's signature recipes. I cut the meat into neat pieces, chewed slowly, pretending I was focused only on eating, while actually listening to their empty chatter about work, traffic, little everyday things, waiting for the moment this whole performance was leading up to. Jason soon cleared his throat, like before a speech, set his utensils down, and without looking directly at me, said casually, "Dad, have you thought lately about maybe updating your will? Just to do everything properly, so no questions come up later." I stopped my fork halfway to my mouth and set it down just as calmly as I'd been cutting the chicken. The click of metal on porcelain sounded surprisingly loud in the silence. I looked at my son properly, not like a father looking at his grown child, but like a judge looking at a witness. His eyes immediately flicked toward Allison, and then back. Too fast. Too tense. "Why are you asking?" I said evenly, not breaking eye contact. He hesitated right away, started mumbling something about, "Just in case, you know. At your age, it's better to have everything sorted out in advance." I deliberately let those words, "at your age," hang in the air, watching as a patch of redness slowly crept up his neck. Allison leaned forward and smiled the way people smile at a doctor when they're about to deliver bad news, warm, but with ice under the skin in her eyes. "Sian, we're only thinking about what's best for you," she said softly. "When everything is done properly, everyone feels calmer, less confusion, fewer reasons for conflict." I took a sip of water, buying myself time to study her more closely. She was holding herself together better than my son, I noticed right away. Her hands looked relaxed, her voice steady, her gaze gentle. But 30 years of reading body language doesn't just disappear. Her left hand was gripping the fork a little too tightly, the tendons standing out on the back of her hand like taut wires. That's not the gesture of someone simply caring about an old man. That's the gesture of someone waiting for the victim to offer their neck. "What conflicts exactly are you trying to prevent?" I asked, in the same calm tone. She blinked, but quickly recovered, falling back on general talk about legal nuances, about how Jason worries that I live alone in such a big house. What if something happens to me? Who would take care of everything then? I nodded, picked up my fork again, and went back to the chicken, letting them interpret my silence however they wanted. Dinner dragged on, sluggishly, like someone stretching a rubber band and not daring to let it snap. After we ate, I sat in the living room in front of the TV, turned on the news, and pretended to be absorbed in another report about rising prices and yet more political statements. In reality, I wasn't watching the screen but the reflection in the black glass, where I could make out the outline of the room. They settled on the couch nearby, their heads almost touching, speaking in low voices. Allison occasionally touched his hand. It could have been a gesture of support, or a gesture of an accomplice, encouraging her partner before a con. Jason nodded, glanced sideways toward me a couple of times, then quickly looked away, confident that I was absorbed in the news. They thought I saw only the flickering screen, not their silhouettes, and not their conspiracy. They didn't know that at that very moment, I had already started building a case, one where he would no longer be my son, but the defendant. That night, I lay in the dark, watching the old ceiling fan spin lazily above me. The blades slowly sliced through the warm air, while my thoughts raced in much tighter circles. My son, my own son, the boy I raised, the one I took on extra work for so I could pay for his college, the one I proudly walked down the aisle to a wedding march, was now sitting in my house, planning how to declare me mentally unfit so he could neatly take everything I had built over my lifetime. A house that, by today's standards, was worth at least $1.5 million, if not more. A large life insurance policy, several more millions in accounts and investments, a plot of land in the Florida mountains that my father had left me. It was more than enough for someone without patience or conscience to decide that waiting for the natural course of things wasn't interesting. I didn't sleep until dawn, and when the first dull strips of light stretched across the ceiling, I was already up, moving through the house almost silently, like a ghost. The mail lay in its usual place by the front door. I immediately knew someone had touched it too. 3 envelopes had been opened and then clumsily sealed again, the white paper slightly swollen along the edges. 2 important letters from the tax office that I had been waiting for all week were gone without a trace. I took out my phone, opened the postal app, and found the tracking numbers I had saved in advance. Both items were marked as delivered, 3 days ago. My hands trembled as I photographed the opened envelopes, but I forced myself to calm down. Inhale, exhale, focus. There was no room for emotions here, only facts, observations, and planning. Back in my study, I stopped in front of the same cabinet with the scratched lock. I gave myself a couple of minutes to let the anger rise, to let it roll through my chest in a wave, and then I pushed it deep inside, to where it no longer interfered with clear thinking. 30 years of watching people lie, dodge, and make excuses taught me another thing. Everyone has a small tell, a personal signal that gives them away. With Jason, it was always his eyes. He could never hold a direct gaze when he was lying, and during that dinner conversation, he couldn't look at me for more than a few seconds at a time. The mosaic in my head began to form into a familiar prosecutor's pattern. Motive, money, more than enough. Opportunity, he lives in my house, has access to the mail, the study, the cabinet. The method was still unclear, but that was technical detail. What mattered was that they had clearly started gathering information and leverage, confident that an old man wouldn't notice, that they could slowly squeeze him out of his own life. I sank into the chair, feeling the familiar pressure of the wooden armrests against my palms, and quietly, into the empty room, almost in a whisper, said, "They decided I'm just a tired old man. They'll soon find out what 30 years in court really teach you, how to collect evidence, how to build a case, and how to strike when no one expects it." The plan began to take shape almost on its own, not as an emotional reaction, but as a case, a complex, multi-layered case. First, I didn't need revenge. I needed knowledge, certainty, and for that, I had to become invisible, make them believe I had stepped aside, disappeared, given up. Then they would relax, start acting openly, and that's when, just as they thought they had won, I could catch them red-handed. They wanted me to disappear from my own life? Fine. I would disappear. Just not the way they imagined. I pulled out a clean notebook, placed a pen on the desk, and began making lists. What I would need, where I could observe the house without being seen, which old acquaintances I could turn to if necessary, people I had once helped, who still remembered that debt. The gears of my countermove slowly clicked into place, and by the time the sun rose above the overheated roofs of the neighborhood, stretching long bands of light across the study floor, I knew exactly what I would do next. Breakfast that day was the same as hundreds before it, the same table, the same mugs, the same smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee. Only now I knew this wasn't just another morning, it was the start of an operation they had no idea about. I spread butter on my toast slowly, like an old man with an empty day ahead. Took a sip, set the cup down a bit awkwardly, as if my hand had trembled, and casually said, "I've been thinking about that old dream of a trip to the mountains, the one your mother and I always planned but never took. And I decided there's no point putting it off anymore. I'll hit the road today for a couple of weeks, clear my head." Jason's fork clinked against his plate a little louder than it should have. He looked up, clearly surprised. "Today?" he asked too quickly. I shrugged, like someone who no longer cared much. "Retirement," I said. "I don't have a schedule anymore. No hearings, no calendar to answer to. There isn't that much life left to keep postponing everything. Your mother always dreamed of seeing those places. I didn't manage to do that while she was alive. At least now I can go for the both of us." I softened my voice on those words so they would hear both real sadness and that shade of vulnerability that instantly disarms a listener. They exchanged glances. The look between them was brief, but heavy. Allison was the first to pull herself together. She leaned toward me, smiled with practiced warmth, and said it was a wonderful idea, that I truly deserved a break, that I shouldn't worry about anything here at home. She repeated that phrase, how I shouldn't worry about anything, and the words hung in the air, almost like a confession. I nodded and lowered my gaze to my plate, pretending I was already mapping out the route in my head, while actually noting how her fingers tapped nervously against the tabletop, like someone barely holding back impatience. Jason, trying to slip into the role of a caring son, asked if I was sure I could handle the drive alone. The road was long, mountains, age. The sentence hung there awkwardly. Even he realized he'd gone too far. I let it hang for a couple of seconds, then sharpened my tone slightly and asked what kind of age-related weakness he had already written me off for. He flinched, started backpedaling, saying that wasn't what he meant, that he was just worried. I softened, gave him a way out, said I'd been driving my whole life and had taken those mountain roads so many times it felt like the roads themselves knew me by heart. He let out a relieved breath, and that relief stung. My own son was glad I wasn't making it harder for him to quietly erase me from my own life. For the rest of the morning, I moved through the house with deliberate, demonstrative methodicalness, the way a person does when they're truly preparing for a long trip. I pulled old hiking boots from the storage room, a jacket for cool mountain evenings, spread maps with marked passes and lookout points across the couch, searched the closet for my old camera. From the outside, it all looked like a normal packing job, but mixed in among the usual items were others. Not for rest, but for work. A good pair of binoculars with night mode, an old, thick notebook that once sat on my desk in court, still with plenty of blank pages, a small digital camera that fit in one hand and could be switched on without drawing attention. I hid all of it among clothes and little personal items, so that at a quick glance the suitcase looked like a tourist's, not a private investigator's. By lunchtime, I had already arranged a neat stack of things for the car in the hallway, checked my documents, and made sure to jingle my keys loudly enough for all this bustle to sink firmly into their memory. The hot Florida day slowly slid past noon, the air in the yard shimmering above the tiles, when I carried the bags out to the car and slowly loaded them into the trunk, partly because my back really was acting up, partly for the performance in which I played the lead role, an old man for whom everything is hard, but who, gritting his teeth, is still setting off on his last big journey. Jason came out to help with the heavier bags. His movements were sharp, a little jerky, like someone torn between guilt and anticipation. When we finished, he stepped closer and hugged me. I hugged him back, as always, but this time I listened, to his body, to the way he breathed, to how he held himself. There was a stiff, wooden tension in his embrace, as if he were hugging not his father, but an unpleasant duty he hoped to be rid of soon. I quietly told him to keep an eye on the house while I was gone. Without looking me in the eyes, he assured me everything would be under control. Behind him, in the doorway, stood Allison. I accepted her dry kiss on the cheek and caught the strong, sharp scent of expensive perfume, something I hadn't noticed on her before. I thought it was probably bought with a different, richer life in mind than the one they had now. But my face stayed calm, even slightly tired. She wished me a good trip and said I deserved the rest. I got behind the wheel and started the car. They stayed on the porch, waving after me, their smiles wider than necessary. In the rearview mirror, I saw how, as soon as they decided I could no longer see them, their expressions changed. Jason wrapped an arm around her waist, Allison said something, and he laughed out loud, like a man who had just had a heavy burden lifted off his shoulders. I drove out of the yard, but instead of heading for the mountains as announced, I turned the other way, not north, but toward the flatlands, where the highway is lined with identical roadside motels and truck stop diners. A few dozen kilometers on hot asphalt, reading road signs, passing familiar fields and tree lines. And there it was, an unremarkable 3-story building with a faded sign and a parking lot half full of cars. I had chosen this place on purpose. Hardly anyone comes here on purpose. There are almost always rooms available for cash, no questions asked. The staff is used to people who come and go without leaving any trace in memory. At the front desk, I showed my real passport, no movie-style games with fake names, but asked to have everything done quickly, without unnecessary interest. I said out loud the explanation I'd prepared, that I was heading farther into the mountains and just needed a place to sleep for the night. The sleepy-looking clerk barely lifted her eyes, filled out some form with practiced motions, took the money, handed me the key, and said the room number. I climbed the stairs to a small, stuffy, but perfectly adequate room for my purposes, with thin carpet, a humming air conditioner, and a TV bolted to the dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time in days, allowed myself 5 minutes of thinking about nothing, absorbing the emptiness of this unfamiliar space. Then I checked the time, gauged how long was left until dark, until that part of the day when homes begin to live differently, when people relax, drop their masks, and any movement against the night stands out especially clearly. I ate a simple sandwich I'd brought with me, washed it down with water, tried to lie down, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept returning to the house, to how they, confident that I was now racing along mountain switchbacks, were moving freely through my rooms, digging through cabinets, discussing the plan that, in their minds, had finally reached the home stretch. When the first dusk thickened outside the window, I took the key, went downstairs, got into the car, and headed back toward the city. But by different streets, not the route I'd taken earlier, but back roads I'd learned by heart over the years. I needed not only to return unnoticed, but also to settle in just as quietly, so I could see my house without being seen. A few blocks of familiar yards, then a quiet street with identical houses. And there it was, across from my property, the empty house that had been up for sale for months, with a faded agency banner and a gray lockbox on the handle. I hadn't walked past it so many times for nothing, and I hadn't paid attention to the people coming for showings for nothing. Once, I'd seen the realtor punch in the code on that box to get the key. My fingers had repeated the combination on their own, and my memory, trained on protocols and case numbers, had simply stored it. Now, in the warm evening air, I walked up to the door, ran my fingers over the plastic buttons, quietly entered the sequence, and the small lock clicked open. Inside lay the key. The house greeted me with the smell of dust and stale air, that same hollow echo you find in places where no one has lived for a long time. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and moved by touch, not turning on the lights, so that not a single strip of brightness would give me away from the street. My eyes quickly adjusted to the dimness. I found a room on the second floor with a large window looking directly at my house. I set up the folding chair I'd brought with me, placed it by the window, took the binoculars from my bag, and checked how they focused on the lit windows across the street. In my house, the lights were on in almost every room. Both cars were in the driveway. Their silhouettes looked perfectly ordinary, but I already knew there was nothing ordinary left in what was happening. I settled in, placed the notebook and pen beside me, switched my phone to silent video recording, and began to watch. Through the glass, the living room was clearly visible. Jason was pacing back and forth across the room. Allison sat on the couch with a phone to her ear, gesturing animatedly with her free hand. From her tone and movements, it was obvious she wasn't just chatting with a friend. She was coordinating something, making arrangements, checking details. There was no trembling left in me, no plaster dust of panic. Over the years, difficult procedural days had often begun with exactly this feeling, as if everything inside cooled to a glass-clear calm, and you finally saw the whole picture instead of scattered fragments. I sat in an empty, unfamiliar house, looking through binoculars at the lit windows of my own, where my table, my living room, my life were being handled by the people I myself had brought under that roof, my son and his wife. And at some point, I understood that the role of the victim they had already sentenced me to in their minds was one I had no intention of accepting. The man they saw as an easy target, a tired old guy they could trick and lead by the nose, had turned into a hunter who could see them while they couldn't see him. And that was probably the first real advantage I had gained in this story. The night was only beginning. A long, heavy watch lay ahead, and I was ready for it. 3 days of surveillance took their toll on me, even though I carefully erased my own traces. The days blended into one long strip, marked only by mugs of lukewarm coffee on the windowsill, empty wrappers from cheap sandwiches in a trash bag, and a stiff back from the folding chair. I sat by the window of that empty house like a man on duty. My eyes burned from constant strain, but my mind stayed clear. Over those days, I wrote down every movement across the street, who came in and when the lights went on in which rooms, when they went off, how Jason and Allison moved through the house, how confidently they behaved there, as if everything already belonged to them. Only one thing was still missing: understanding exactly what they were preparing and with whom. One evening, as I was once again noting the time in my notebook, I heard footsteps downstairs near the front door, unhurried, confident ones. I instantly tightened my grip on my phone, my thumb automatically hovering over the emergency call button. In seconds, my thoughts ran through a whole procedural chain. Who could it be? The owner, a realtor, the police. If someone had noticed the lock had been touched? I was already about to say the standard line about just coming to look at the house, thinking of moving, when the door opened and a short female figure appeared in the doorway. It was Tara, my neighbor from 2 houses down, with whom I had lived side by side for almost my entire Florida life. Her small, slender figure against the still bright evening light looked almost like a shadow. She was wearing a light cardigan, clearly a favorite one, far too warm for this heat, comfortable shoes, her gray hair neatly pulled into a bun. But I froze not because of how she looked, but because of the expression on her face. There was no surprise, no confusion at suddenly seeing me in someone else's house, only calm, attentive recognition, like someone who had understood everything a long time ago. My throat went dry, and I asked almost in a whisper what she was doing here. She closed the door behind her as if she had done it many times before, set her bag against the wall, and simply said that she was doing the same thing I was, trying to get to the truth. The judge's instinct kicked in immediately. My first reaction was denial, a reflex sharpened over years. Never admit anything extra until you're forced to. I said I didn't understand what truth she was talking about. But she just waved her hand, walked over to the window, stood beside me, rested her palm on the sill, and pointed with an outstretched finger at my house. "That second-floor window," she said calmly. From there, I saw Allison on Tuesday walking through the rooms and photographing each one, carefully, in order. That's not how people take family memories. That's how they document a place before a sale. I tightened my grip on the binoculars until my knuckles turned white. "So you've been watching my house all this time?" I asked. Tara gave a faint smile and said she'd been watching this whole street for 40 years, including my house, simply because she lives here. And the habit of paying attention never leaves someone who spent her life working as a nurse. She pulled a small, worn notebook from her cardigan, opened it, and showed me pages filled with her neat, tiny handwriting. Dates, exact times, short notes. "Tuesday afternoon," she said, pointing. An unfamiliar man in a suit came by, carrying a leather folder. He stayed briefly, 15 minutes, maybe a little more. Allison let him in. Jason was home too. On Thursday, he came again. This time he stayed almost an hour. Both times they didn't behave like casual visitors, but like people who came to settle serious matters. Without even noticing it, I leaned closer to her notes, automatically fixing the dates and times in my head. It looked absurdly like an observation log. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" I asked, looking straight at her. She met my gaze just as steadily, without the usual absent-mindedness people expect at her age, and said that age doesn't cancel eyesight. She sees perfectly well who enters my house and when. I stepped back from the window, trying to regain internal control, and said that these were family matters and I would handle them myself. But she cut me off in a dry, almost clinical tone. When a family robs a person right in front of his eyes, it's no longer just his private business. In a neighborhood like this, where everyone has known each other for decades, it concerns everyone. Her words sounded like a diagnosis you already suspected but kept delaying. I tried to object, asked why she thought anyone was robbing me. She simply nodded toward my own things, the open notebook, the binoculars, the chair by the window, and said that if everything were fine, I wouldn't be spending a third night in a row in an empty stranger's house, watching my own home at night like a crime scene. Silence hung in the room. From outside came the muffled sound of passing cars. The air conditioner hummed somewhere in the background, and we stood by the window, looking at the same house with completely different feelings. I finally asked the question that had been spinning in my head since the moment she appeared at the door, what she had meant by that mysterious, "By midnight you'll see everything," she had whispered to me a couple of days earlier in the yard. She turned toward the window, her profile outlined against the darkening sky, and said that Jason and Allison were sure I was far away now, so they had already started to relax, and that anyone who understands human habits even a little could see how they were setting everything up for a decisive move. According to her notes, the man in the suit came during the day, on weekdays, which meant the dirtiest things would be done at night, when they believed no one would see. I asked where such confidence came from. She tapped her notebook like a doctor tapping a medical chart and said that the habit of spotting repeating patterns comes with experience. On Tuesday, the man with the folder showed up in the middle of the day. On Thursday, the same. That evening, Jason spent a long time in the garage, carrying out boxes, which meant they were preparing something, packing something. And logically, they wouldn't drag it out any longer. Too much had already been done. They believed too strongly in my disappearance. Tonight, she said, was the most convenient moment for them. She said it without drama, like a simple conclusion drawn from observation. The word trust had long since fallen out of my active vocabulary. For days, I had been alone with my suspicions, my anger, and a sense of shame, not shame before them, but before myself for allowing this to happen so close to me. And it seemed completely impossible to share that burden with anyone else, even a neighbor. While I was still thinking about it, Tara was already pulling a thermos from her bag, a couple of paper cups, neatly wrapped sandwiches, and setting everything on the windowsill next to my notes, as if we had agreed in advance on a shared night watch. Without meaning to, I asked almost childishly why she was doing all this, why she had gotten involved at all. She froze for a second, holding the cup halfway to her mouth, then spoke quietly, but with such weight that every word seemed to fall to the floor like a stone. Long ago, she said, she had watched her own daughter strip her bare under the guise of care, slipping papers in front of her, siphoning off money, and she had stayed silent then, out of love, out of fear, out of hope that things would somehow work out. In the end, she was left without a daughter, without money, and without self-respect, and she had no intention of watching the same thing happen again, just across the street. Something inside me loosened, like a belt being eased by one notch. I whispered that I was sorry, even though I knew that fixed nothing. She waved it off, saying pity wouldn't help, but preparation would. She handed me a cup of strong coffee and said that by midnight I'd need the clearest head possible, and that this wasn't something to watch alone. I took the cup, breathed in the familiar, almost homely smell, and sat back down on the chair by the window. She pulled a second folding chair from her bag, unfolded it, set it beside mine, and settled in as if she'd been doing this her whole life. We sat side by side, silently watching as the day slowly drained away beyond the windows. The Florida sky shifted from orange to deep violet, then grew darker, almost black, as the lights in neighboring houses went out one by one. My house across the street stood out as a bright rectangle. The lights were on almost everywhere. In the living room, Jason was still pacing back and forth, the glow of his phone screen flashing in his hand. Allison barely let go of her smartphone, talking animatedly to someone, making wide, confident gestures. Every movement of hers showed she was sure the plan was running on schedule. From time to time, Tara poured us more coffee and offered a piece of sandwich. I chewed almost mechanically, not tasting anything, because all my attention was fixed beyond the glass. The hours dragged on. The hands of the small travel clock I'd brought with me crept from mark to mark, one evening hour replacing another. The neighbors' houses darkened, the yard fell still, and only my home remained a glowing island where my own trouble breathed, moved, and walked from room to room. Closer to night, they began coming to the windows more often, peering out into the street, checking if everything was quiet, if no one was around, if everything was ready. Tara touched my elbow when the clock was already nearing the hour she had spoken about. Her fingers were dry but firm. Inside me, my heart was pounding like it hadn't even during the tensest court hearings. Those 3 days had turned into a long preparation phase, and now the main act of their performance was about to begin. All I could do was watch, listen, record, and remember, because somewhere out there in the night, the car of that same man with the folder was already on its way to my house. And a few minutes before midnight, I was about to see with my own eyes just how far my son and his wife were willing to go. 20 minutes to midnight, when the heat outside had eased but the air still felt heavy, like a wet blanket, streaks of headlights slid along the street in front of my house. Tara gripped my arm above the elbow and whispered that they were here. I raised the binoculars and focused. From the direction of downtown, a dark sedan rolled in slowly. Its headlights brushed softly across the front of my house. The car turned toward my gate and eased to a stop by the fence. The engine died. In the sudden silence, a car door slammed clearly. A man stepped out, wearing a dark suit and tie, a leather briefcase in his right hand. He automatically glanced at his watch, then scanned the street, like someone who understood perfectly well that setting a meeting at this hour in a quiet residential area was not for small talk. "That's him," Tara said quietly. I turned from the window and looked at her questioningly. She explained that after his second visit, she'd gone online and looked him up by name and agency. His name was Hannigan, Leonard Hannigan, an experienced realtor who specialized in homes in our area and the surrounding suburbs. I nodded. The name instantly slid into place in my head, next to dates and times, like in a personal case register. Without a word, I raised my phone, braced my shoulder against the window frame to keep it steady, and managed to photograph his license plate as he walked up the path to the porch. Tara was already pulling out her notebook and automatically writing down his name, the car make, and the approximate time. The lock on my door turned even before he reached the porch, meaning Jason was standing inside, waiting. The door swung open, and my son appeared in the doorway, a silhouette I'd known since childhood, now moving with a tense, unfamiliar stiffness. They exchanged a couple of short phrases. I couldn't hear the words, only saw the nods. No handshake, no attempt to stretch out the greeting. Everything was dry and businesslike, exactly as it should be for people with something to hide and little time. Jason stepped aside to let the guest in. The door closed, but an even brighter light spilled into the living room windows. The silhouettes moved deeper into the house. Tara and I shifted closer to the center of the window. I cracked it open a few inches so the glass wouldn't fog, and turned the binoculars toward the dining room. There, at my large table, the one I'd once bought for my wife's anniversary, something was happening that would make any judge feel cold inside. Leonard Hannigan set his briefcase on the table and clicked the latches open. Jason hurriedly pulled out a chair and stood off to the side, like a schoolboy at an exam. Allison came in from the hallway, and in her hands I saw a red folder, the very one that for years had sat in my safe, closer to the back, on top of the others, always within reach, just in case. That folder was my personal anchor. Inside were the original deed to the house, the old will, financial documents, insurance papers, everything that described my life in the language of stamps and signatures. Now, without the resistance of metal, it was in my daughter-in-law's hands. Allison placed the folder on the table, opened it, and fanned the documents out in front of the realtor. He sat down, pulled them closer, and began flipping through them with the motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He held one sheet up to the light to check the watermarks, ran a finger over a seal, studied the signatures, then took the next page. Meanwhile, I was snapping photo after photo on my phone, frame by frame, so I could later zoom in and see exactly what was on the table and who touched what. Leonard's professional manner was obvious even from this distance. He didn't fidget or rush, just went down the list, checking each page with polished focus. It should have reassured me. Serious people don't get involved in outright filth. Instead, it frightened me. If a forgery passed his experienced eye, proving its illegality later would be far harder. Beside him, on his right, sat Jason, and his body at that moment was a living textbook on guilt. He kept shifting positions, drumming his fingers on the table edge, grabbing his glass and setting it down again without taking a sip. There was only one thing he didn't do. He didn't stand up and say this was madness and had to stop. Allison, by contrast, sat almost motionless, only occasionally adjusting her hair or sliding another sheet toward Leonard. In her shoulders, in the tilt of her head, was the confidence of someone who had thought the plan through down to the smallest detail and believed there were no cracks. Each time the realtor asked a question, she answered sparingly, with a nod or a short phrase, no extra expression. That's how people speak when they've rehearsed everything in advance. I recorded it all, the tilt of heads, the direction of glances, the distance between hands. It might seem ridiculous to someone who's never dealt with fraud cases, but details like these sometimes decide everything later. Time stretched like thick syrup. In the Florida night, the street was almost empty, while inside my living room a quiet business operation was in full swing. At some point, the papers stopped changing hands and were stacked neatly in front of Leonard. He opened one of his folders, pulled out documents he had clearly prepared in advance, and laid them out in front of Jason and Allison. Jason took the pen, hesitated for a second, as if there was still a thin last thread of conscience left inside him, something he could cling to, but then he signed. Allison signed right after him. Her hand moved confidently, without pause, like someone who leaves herself no way back. I recorded every movement, every tilted shoulder, every page lifted toward the light, so there would be no gaps left later. Somewhere on the edge of my awareness, I felt a tremor creep into my fingers, the natural human urge to snap, to leave the house across the street, cross the road, fling open my own door, grab all three of them by the collar, shove their faces into the red folder, and ask if they even understood what they were doing and who they were doing it to. But the inner discipline I had demanded from others for so many years in the courtroom was now required of me. I took a deep breath, exhaled, rested my free hand on my knee, feeling the rough fabric of my pants under my fingers, and told myself exactly what I used to tell agitated victims. Solid evidence is stronger than any shouting. Without taking her eyes off the window, Tara seemed to read my thoughts and quietly reminded me that right now, what mattered most wasn't emotion, but the material we were gathering. That any court would look not at how I yelled on the porch at night, but at what I could show by dates, times, people, and documents. I nodded, though she couldn't see it, and raised my phone again. Through the binoculars, I saw Leonard put the papers back into his briefcase, stacking them neatly inside. Click. The latches closed. Jason let out a breath as if he'd just dropped a backpack full of stones from his shoulders. Allison stepped away for a moment toward the kitchen and came back with a bottle. From the silhouette alone, I immediately recognized expensive, sparkling wine, clearly not something bought for a family dinner. She brought 3 tall glasses, set them on the table, and with a slightly theatrical gesture, opened the bottle. Foam rose to the neck. She caught it neatly with a napkin and poured the drink into the glasses. She handed one to Leonard, one to Jason, and took the third herself. They raised their glasses. Glass clinked against glass. I hit record again, capturing the moment as if I were documenting the signing of a verdict. Only this time, the verdict was being passed on me, not by me. They laughed, said something. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Their gestures and expressions said enough. These were the faces of people convinced they had passed the hardest stretch, that all that remained was to finish the process and collect the money. A few minutes later, Leonard set his unfinished glass aside, stood up, and shook hands with both of them, formally, almost dryly, making it clear that his part of the job for tonight was done. Tara and I moved quickly to the other window facing the front. She quietly, avoiding any creak, cracked it open. Warm night air rushed in, carrying the smell of heated asphalt and damp grass, and almost immediately my front door slammed. All 3 stepped out onto the porch. Light from the entryway flooded their figures like a stage spotlight. Leonard stood slightly apart, holding his briefcase. Jason and Allison positioned themselves facing him, and now their words reached us, not just through gestures, but clearly. If the power of attorney is in order, we go to closing on the 15th, Leonard said in that even, professional voice I knew so well from dozens of other realtors. The buyers are offering mostly cash. The rest will go through a transfer. Those words hit me as hard as the strike of a gavel once had. They contained everything I needed: mention of the power of attorney, a clearly named date, reference to specific buyers, and the method of payment. Jason hurriedly assured him that the power of attorney was completely legal, that I had signed it back in the spring. Lies came hard to him. Nervous tension rang in his voice, but he said them anyway, because somewhere inside he had already chosen a side. I stood at the window of a stranger's house and listened as my son, the same son I had once explained to that a forged signature on a power of attorney is a criminal offense, now calmly assured a third party that everything was clean. Allison stepped into the conversation, softly but insistently, saying they had thought everything through long ago, that nothing here was accidental, that this plan had been months in the making. And in her voice, there wasn't a trace of doubt or remorse, only confidence that they had carefully covered every angle and that I was far away and would never find out. Leonard nodded and said that by procedure, of course, he would have to check the documents with the registry and confirm there were no restrictions on the house. But based on the papers he'd seen, everything looked proper, which meant that in a couple of weeks they would calmly meet at the office and close the deal. They shook hands once more. Jason said something from which I caught only a fragment of thanks and a promise to quickly gather the remaining certificates. Allison laughed brightly, adding something about being free very soon. The 3 of them went down the steps together. Leonard got into his car and started it. The red glow of the brake lights lit up their faces for a second, and then the car rolled smoothly away and disappeared into the darkness of the street. Jason and Allison stood on the porch for another couple of minutes, watching it go, then turned to each other. My son leaned in and said something the wind carried to us only in fragments, but the meaning was clear, something like, "Just a little longer, and it'll all be over." Allison laughed openly now, joyfully, like someone who sees not just money ahead, but a new life, one foreign to me, that she was building on the ruins of mine. They went back into the house. The living room lights went out, the porch light clicked off as well. The street returned to its usual nighttime quiet. Only inside my head, that quiet could no longer settle. I remained standing by the window with my phone in my hand, staring at the dark facade of my own house, where just minutes earlier my fate had been decided. On the table behind me lay Tara's notebook with its neatly written lines. True to her habit, it already contained the time the car arrived, a rough description of the man, phrases about the power of attorney, the deal date, the cash payment. She closed the notebook, looked up at me, and calmly asked whether I understood everything now, whether I truly saw what was happening. I nodded. My voice was hoarse when I finally forced out that my son had lied to the realtor, that I had never signed any power of attorney in my life, which meant there was only one explanation: the signature had been forged. She clarified without hesitation that this meant forgery of my signature on a notarized power of attorney for the purpose of transferring real estate. In other words, fraud. I said the word out loud, a word I had heard for decades in other people's cases, but had never imagined applying to my own family, and felt something inside me finally fall into place. Tara asked what I intended to do next, and at that moment, the shock truly receded, giving way to that same cold, focused state in which I was used to entering the courtroom. I told her I would first let them play their hand all the way through, allow them to arrive at the closing confident in their victory, and then show them what happens when you try to deceive not just the law, but a man who has spent his entire life breathing it. The image of the car's headlights slowly moving down our street, and their red glow on Jason's and Allison's faces by the porch, stayed before my eyes for a long time whenever I closed them. The scene of the nighttime meeting, the red folder on the table, and the clink of glasses over what was, in essence, my life, replayed again and again. But now, with the first wave of shock gone, I was looking at that picture no longer as a nightmare, but as case material, one I still had to build and carry through to its logical end. I was missing one key piece, the fake document on which their entire plan rested. And I knew that if I wanted to get it, I would have to enter my own house the way suspects once did during searches, quietly, quickly, and without witnesses. For a few more days, I didn't rush anything. I stayed in the empty house across the street like a sentry, studying their daily routine the same way I once studied the schedules of witnesses and suspects. A clear pattern emerged very quickly. On weekdays, Jason left for downtown at almost the same time every morning. Around 8:30, his silver car rolled out of the gate, turned toward the main road, and disappeared. Allison had her own route. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she drove toward the shopping center, usually returned a couple of hours later with bags, sometimes stopped by a friend's place along the way. In any case, around midday the house was empty for a while, and watching the clock, I understood that my window of opportunity wouldn't be very long. I chose Thursday. In my head, I automatically noted that it was already the second week after their nighttime celebration, a day when I would have relatively more time and fewer extra eyes. That morning, I got into my car a short distance from the house across the street, moved to a neighboring block, and stopped so I could see my gate while remaining unseen myself. Around 8:30, like clockwork, Jason's silver car crawled out of the yard. He closed the gate, got behind the wheel, and drove off toward downtown. I waited another 40 minutes, counting my breaths, until I saw Allison's black car with tinted windows pull out as well. She turned toward the highway. I waited a good 10 more minutes, just in case one of them suddenly remembered a forgotten phone or folder and came back. Only when the street settled again into its usual morning quiet did I pull out from around the corner and stop right in front of my own house. Legally, in every sense. The key turned in the lock as smoothly as always, though my fingers, I won't lie, trembled. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and listened. The air conditioner hummed evenly, and in the living room the TV murmured softly on a news channel, left on to create the illusion of presence. It was an old, familiar trick, and the fact that it was now being used against me in my own house created a strange feeling, as if I hadn't come home, but broken into someone else's place where the owner could appear at any moment. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that the law was on my side. This was my house, my walls, my papers. And if anyone here was an illegal guest, it certainly wasn't me. The guest bedroom, where visiting relatives used to stay, had over the past few months turned into Jason's office. From the house across the street, I'd seen him working there on his laptop in the evenings, while my actual room stayed locked. Now, pushing the door open, I saw a typical working mess. An open laptop, stacks of papers, a notebook stained with coffee, pens pushed into a pile. At first glance, just the usual chaos of a busy person. I didn't linger on the surface. By old habit, I started with the drawers. The top one, small stuff, paper clips, brochures, some pencils. Below that, documents neatly arranged in folders, his work papers, insurance policies, contracts. In the very bottom drawer, beneath a pile of envelopes and folders, I saw a familiar corner of red cardboard. My heart thumped harder, but I forced myself to act with my head, not my hands. Carefully, I pulled the folder out, placed it on the desk, and opened it. Inside were my papers, as expected, but no longer in the order I'd once left them in the safe. On top lay a sheet titled Power of Attorney, allegedly issued in my name, dated late May. The text was competently drafted, the notarial language precise, the seals neatly scanned, and at the bottom was a signature, very close to mine. Close enough that someone who had never seen me sign could easily have no doubts. I studied it for a long time, by strokes, by pressure, by how each letter was formed, and fairly quickly noticed what an ordinary eye would miss. The loop in one of the letters curved slightly differently than I always do, and more importantly, the color and sheen of the ink gave away that the signature had been added much later than the rest of the text. Almost, I caught myself saying out loud. Almost right, almost neat, and it's in the almost that the crime lives. I took out my phone and began photographing the page from different angles, close-ups of the signature, the seal, the date. Then, unhurriedly, I went through the rest of the folder. There was a preliminary sales agreement for the house, in which Jason and Allison appeared as persons authorized to act on my behalf. The buyer was listed as a certain Robert Mullen, a man from Atlanta who had long been eyeing Florida. The proposed date for the final contract fell in the second half of the month, slightly later than the date mentioned in the conversation with the realtor. It also stated that payment would be partly in cash and partly by transfer. The amount, of course, was substantial, in dollars, but that didn't make the overall picture any less vile. I flipped through the pages one by one, photographing each sheet and each stamp, until a thin stack of printouts on plain office paper slipped out from under one of the documents. It nearly slid off the edge of the desk. I caught it at the last second, brought it back into the light, and saw what I both expected and dreaded. It was email correspondence. The sender's address clearly belonged to Allison. At least her name was in the header. The recipient was someone named Chris. From the text, it was obvious he wasn't just an acquaintance, but a man she had other plans for her life with. In one email, it was written plainly that once the house was sold, she would get her half, around $750,000, and that would be enough to leave Jason, take the kids, and start over in Atlanta, near Chris. In another, she openly admitted that Jason firmly believed they were selling the house to buy another one here in Florida, closer to downtown, that he couldn't even imagine she would leave immediately after the deal, and that all she had to do was hold out until the day the money hit the account. I felt bitterness rise in my throat, not from gloating, but from a strange, scorched emptiness. It turned out that betrayal in this story ran in circles. To them, I was a convenient financial target, my house and savings their prize. Jason, trying to speed up his inheritance, was himself becoming just another stepping stone for Allison, a platform she would toss over the railing the moment the desired million was secured. And no matter how much one might want to see some kind of punishment for the guilty, this realization brought no relief. It didn't make things easier that my son was also becoming a victim, because by this point, he had already taken too many steps toward a cold, cynical crime. Silently, line by line, I photographed all the emails, every phrase, every mention of dates and amounts. Then, I carefully folded the printouts back to where they had been, slipped them between the same documents as before, made sure the corners lined up, that no new creases appeared on the back of the folder. Then, just as carefully, I returned the folder to the bottom drawer, laid the envelopes and other folders back on top as they were, closed the drawer, straightened the keyboard on the desk, and stepped back, giving myself a second to look at the room with a stranger's eye, to be sure nothing gave away my visit. Before leaving, I walked through the house, not like a thief, but like someone taking a final look at what had long been the unshakable center of his life. The kitchen, where I once taught Jason to cook the simplest things so he could feed himself during his student years. The living room, where we watched games and argued about referee calls. The hallway with photographs where my wife was still smiling, where my son's diploma hung on the wall, along with his childhood drawings. Now, all of those images felt like frames around a crack that had spread up from the foundation. I ran my hand along the back of the old armchair, over the doorframe, breathed in the smell of the house, and realized that even if the walls remained mine, the life I once had here would never return. Leaving through the front door felt like an unnecessary risk, so I used the small gate in the far corner of the yard, the way neighbors used to when cutting through the garden. I crossed the neighboring yard, came out onto a parallel street, got into my car, and drove back to the roadside motel without turning on the radio or checking the mirror more than necessary. There, in my temporary refuge, I turned the small room into an improvised headquarters, or, as I thought of it, a war room. I set up my laptop on the desk, connected my phone, and began uploading everything I had gathered over the past few days. Folder after folder, email after email, photos of the night meeting, shots from the porch, printouts of correspondence, every small detail Tara and I had documented. Her notebook lay beside it, open to the last pages, where dates, arrival times, phrases about the power of attorney, and the deal were neatly written. I sorted the materials by meaning. One stack held photos of the damaged lock and signs of tampering, another the suspicious envelopes, a third the images of the power of attorney and the contract with the buyer. I kept Allison's correspondence with Chris separate and the night shots of Leonard Hannigan in their own folder. What took shape before my eyes was no longer a family misunderstanding, but a full-fledged scheme where each link connected to the next, and that very connection made it vulnerable in court. When I finally pulled away from the desk and reached for the phone, it was long past dark outside. Tara's familiar voice came through after the first ring. She didn't ask if there was news. It was obvious I wouldn't be calling without a reason. Calmly, point by point, I told her what I had found. The power of attorney I had never signed, the preliminary sales agreement, Allison's emails, the fact that in those messages she openly wrote about leaving Jason as soon as she got her share. There was a short, heavy pause on the other end. Then she asked only one thing: had I gone into the house? I answered that it was my house and my documents, and if anyone had violated someone else's property, it certainly wasn't me. She asked again if I understood what I was stepping into now. I said I understood perfectly well that this was no longer a family table conversation, but a case that would have to be taken all the way to a verdict, and that I had no intention of sitting back and waiting to be quietly erased from my own life. She sighed softly, wished me strength in her own way, and reminded me she was ready to confirm her observations if it came to investigators and court. I thanked her, hung up, and sat for a long time in silence, staring at the papers spread across the table and the glowing thumbnails of photos on the screen. I barely slept that night, but it wasn't the same insomnia that had crushed me in the first days, when my mind bounced between how could this happen and why. Now my thoughts lined up into a sequence of steps. I sat with a notebook and pen, and for the first time in a long while, felt not like a confused father, but like a lawyer preparing for a complex case. On one page, I listed which pieces of evidence would need expert verification. On another, which specialist to contact and in what order, so they wouldn't have time to regroup, destroy documents, or wriggle out. With each new line, the pain of being a parent didn't disappear, but it moved to the background, giving way to a familiar, cold focus. This was no longer a melodrama about an ungrateful son. It was becoming a fraud case involving forged documents, and I intended to run it the same way I had run dozens of others. Only this time, I was the victim, which meant I had no right to make mistakes. In the morning, waking up in the cramped motel room, I took out of my suitcase not sweatpants and a worn shirt, but my judicial suit, dark blue, strict, the very one in which I had entered courtrooms dozens of times. I smoothed the trousers with my palm, tied the tie in a neat knot, and looked at myself in the slightly cloudy mirror above the sink. Looking back at me was not a lost father, but a man who had dealt with the law his entire life and intended to rely on it to the very end. I took my briefcase, carefully placed the printed photos and the notebook inside, and drove into the city along the familiar road, but now in a different role. My first stop was the notary, Shannon Wheeler. We had known each other for years through work. She handled wills, prenuptial agreements, and appeared in court as a witness in complex transactions. Her office was in an old house near the district courthouse where I had once presided. When the secretary saw me, she raised her eyebrows in surprise, but led me into the office without questions. Shannon stood up from her desk, greeted me warmly, asked whether I had ever seriously considered retirement. I sat down, placed the briefcase beside me, and said that retirement might have to wait because I had a serious matter. Briefly, without embellishment, but without minimizing anything, I told her what I had discovered, that my son possessed a power of attorney to dispose of my house, which I had never signed in my life. I told her about the tampered cabinet, the night meeting with the realtor, the intention to sell the house without my knowledge. Shannon listened with a slight frown, making notes on a sheet of paper. Then she asked directly whether I was prepared to state under oath that I had never issued any power of attorney to manage my house, to my son or anyone else. I said that was exactly why I had come. She prepared a statement clearly declaring that I, of sound mind and clear memory, without any pressure, confirmed that I had never granted any powers of attorney for the sale, gift, pledge, or exchange of my house, and had never signed any such documents before a notary. When she handed me the document to read, I checked every line, made sure there was no ambiguity, and signed where she indicated. Shannon looked up and said she understood how difficult it was to act against one's own son, then added dryly that for a notary, there is only one measure, the text and the signature, and that this statement would now carry the weight of a document any court must consider. She stamped the paper. The dry, familiar thump of the seal echoed inside me, just like the strike of a judge's gavel. I thanked her, took the certified copy, placed it in a separate clear folder, and stepped outside. The air felt even hotter, but inside it was a little easier. This was the first official line drawn on the side of my truth. My next stop was the bank where I held my accounts and where the mortgage on the house had once been tied. The mortgage was long paid off, but the bank was the same, an office near the park where my wife and I used to walk on weekends. I had known the branch manager, Eddie Burke, for many years. When he saw me, he stood up, shook my hand. There was genuine surprise in his voice. He said he thought I was enjoying the mountains, not the Florida heat. I replied that the mountains could wait, but the matter I'd come to him with could not. We went into his office. I placed a folder of copies in front of him, without revealing everything, but made the essence clear. There was a real risk of attempts to carry out transactions involving my house and funds using forged documents. Eddie grew serious, stopped smiling, adjusted his glasses out of habit, and asked what exactly I wanted from the bank. I said plainly that until I personally submitted written instructions, no large sums were to leave my accounts, No powers of attorney or receipts from third parties were to be accepted, and absolutely no operations related to the sale of the house were to be conducted without my personal presence and passport. He nodded, typed something into the system, began clarifying details, asked several follow-up questions, whether anyone else had access to the cards, whether I had ever issued powers of attorney to manage the accounts. I calmly answered, point by point, that I had granted no such authority to anyone. He noted this, placed an internal hold on operations related to real estate and large withdrawals, printed an internal memo stating that any transactions using my name must be verified through him personally. He handed me the paper and said he understood how unpleasant all of this sounded, but from a legal standpoint, we were protecting ourselves correctly. I thanked him for his speed and seriousness, took the copy, and felt another brick settle into the wall between my house and other people's hands with a soft, heavy sound. From there, I went to a lawyer I had carefully chosen the night before, sitting in the motel with my laptop. Her name was Karen Frost, an attorney who had spent many years handling inheritance and asset protection cases. Her office was in a modern business center on the edge of downtown, reception area, leather chairs, neatly framed diplomas on the walls. She met me in a conference room with a long table and offered tea. I declined and said I preferred to finish business first and drink later. I laid out the situation, this time without the emotional family drama, focusing on the essentials. There was a house, there was reason to believe close relatives were trying to sell it using a forged power of attorney, and there was a notarized statement confirming I had never granted them any authority. She listened carefully, without interrupting, asking only precise, professional questions. Did I have copies of the alleged power of attorney? Photos of the damaged lock? Witnesses who could confirm that during the period when the power of attorney was supposedly signed, I had not visited any notary at all? I nodded, told her about the nighttime surveillance, about Tara, about the documents I had found and the recorded conversations, but clarified that officially I wasn't accusing anyone yet. I wanted first and foremost to protect the house from any registration actions without my involvement. Karen paused for a moment, then calmly laid out what could be done quickly and effectively. First, she explained, we file an application with the registration authority, through the nearest office, prohibiting any registration actions involving the house without your personal presence, your live fingerprint, passport, and signature. That means no power of attorney, even a perfectly forged one, will allow a transaction. The registrar simply won't accept the documents. Second, we can prepare an updated will or inheritance agreement in advance, so it's clear to everyone that the house is distributed in a specific way, and no one can later claim, this is what he wanted, without proof. I asked how quickly all of this could be done. She said the application restricting registration actions could be filed the same day we signed it, and within a short time, the restriction would already appear in the system. The will, she said, she could prepare immediately. We went through the text together, keeping the overall distribution of assets as I had always intended, but specifically stating that the house, as an asset, was under special protection, and that any attempts to challenge this document would look in court not like an honest inheritance dispute, but like a deliberate attempt to bypass the owner's will. Together we went to the nearest registration office. I patiently sat in line like an ordinary person, without any old judge's habits of skipping queues. I submitted the application and showed my passport. The clerk checked the details and asked several times whether I understood the meaning of the restriction, that from now on, no one could sell, gift, or mortgage the house without my personal participation. I said that was exactly what I wanted, almost physically feeling another invisible lock snap shut. Karen took a copy of the application and said she would attach it to all the materials she was beginning to prepare for my case. Then we returned to her office, where she dictated the text of a power of attorney naming her as my representative, not for disposing of the house, but specifically for handling matters related to challenging forged documents and filing applications with investigative bodies and the court. I signed. The notary she worked with certified it immediately. The stamp landed next to my signature, and I now had someone who could officially and legally carry the case forward, even if someone suddenly tried to declare me incompetent. When we finished, evening was already approaching. I thanked her. We agreed that I would hand over all materials, photos, audio recordings, document copies, and that she, in turn, would prepare complaints to the police and the registration authorities. But they would not be filed immediately, only on the day Jason and Allison came to the closing for the house sale. We discussed this in advance. I told her it was important not only to stop them, but to do it in a way that left them no room to pretend they hadn't understood what they were doing. Karen agreed in a businesslike manner, noting that from an evidentiary standpoint, exposing the entire scheme publicly right at the deal would only work in our favor. I returned to the roadside motel after dark, tired but focused. I spread everything I had out on the bed and the table. Now, alongside the photos of the lock, the envelopes, the power of attorney and the contract, the correspondence between Allison and her Chris, and the recordings of the nighttime meeting with the realtor, there were new additions. The notarized statement confirming I had issued no power of attorney, the bank order blocking suspicious transactions, and copies of the new will and the application filed with the registration service. I sorted everything by purpose into separate folders. One folder was for pure criminal evidence, signature forgery, the tampered cabinet, missing mail. The second was for protective measures, the notary, the bank, the registration authority. The third was for witnesses, recorded conversations, Tara's notebook, her future written testimony. The fourth was for Karen's forthcoming procedural documents. With each folder, with each sheet, the paper stopped being just paper. Before me was a case taking shape, where lines of accusation, lines of defense, and fallback positions were as clear as on a military map. I copied the most important files onto a separate flash drive. I prepared a second copy for a bank-safe deposit box I had arranged earlier that day with Eddie. A third set I assembled for Karen, so she would always have a complete file. One more printed folder I decided to give to Tara, the person who had stood by me from the beginning and was ready to go all the way, so that even in the worst-case scenario, there would be several independent repositories of the truth. When I finally sat down, resting my hands on my knees, the roadside darkness outside the window was just as thick and heavy as on those nights when I sat in the empty house across the street. But now, that darkness no longer carried the same sense of helplessness that had crushed me in the first days. Now I didn't have just fear or just anger, but a clear sequence of steps, backed by stamps, signatures, and witnesses no one could dismiss. The most unpleasant part still lay ahead, returning home as if nothing had happened, sitting at the same table with them again, and playing the role of a forgetful old man while they finished painting their picture of victory. But that was the next phase of the game, and I intended to play it through to the very last line. Officially, I returned home a few days before the closing, like a law-abiding retiree who had decided the mountain air wasn't good for him. In the middle of the day, when the sun was nearly overhead, I turned onto our street. The gates of my familiar yard stood before me just as always, only now I knew that in their minds, everything behind them had already been divided up. I automatically noticed that the lawn was trimmed, the flower beds watered, everything neat, as if life here had gone on as usual. I deliberately rattled the keys in the lock, giving them time to prepare, and loudly, in a homely voice, announced in the hallway that I had come back earlier than planned because the mountains, apparently, hadn't done me any good. Jason appeared from the kitchen almost immediately. For a split second he froze, his shoulders lifting slightly, something like fear flashing across his face, the look of a student caught doing something forbidden. Then a smile was quickly pulled over it. He stepped toward me, forced surprise ringing in his voice. "Dad, what a surprise. How are you? Everything okay?" Allison came down behind him, adjusting her hair as she walked. The smile on her face was sympathetic, Her words correct, about how the altitude and climate change must have taken their toll, that I wasn't the age for such exploits anymore. But behind all those phrases was the main thing. They didn't yet know how much I knew, and they very much wanted to find out. I set down my suitcase, let out a heavy sigh, leaned a hand against the wall, and said that yes, my head had been splitting, my blood pressure must have spiked, I'd barely been able to pull myself together for a couple of days. I decided health mattered more, and came back to my own bed, even if it was with regret that I hadn't made it to the places my late wife and I had once dreamed of seeing. It was only half true, but I deliberately let them hear exactly the fatigue and weakness they wanted to see. Jason and Allison exchanged glances. In that look, there was relief mixed with quick assessment. How tired I really was, how much I had fallen apart over these days. I asked to step into the study, saying I needed to check the mail and bills. I went in, locked the door behind me, and just stood in the middle of the room for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar space. Everything was almost exactly as I'd left it before the trip, except that a couple of fresh scratches had appeared on the cabinet lock. I ran my fingers over them so I could later describe them word for word if needed, then went back to dinner. That evening at the table, the game was no longer one-sided. All three of us were playing, each in our own role. Only two of us didn't know that the third person's script had been written long ago. Jason, just as I expected, started with cautious probes. Between talk about the weather and work, he slipped in that he'd noticed I'd recently been forgetting things. Keys, documents, leaving the lights on. I set my fork down and asked whether it was really that noticeable. I added a hint of uncertainty to my voice, like someone beginning to doubt himself. Allison picked it up immediately, saying it was natural at my age, that the brain gets tired, that it might be worth seeing a doctor to check whether this was the early stage of something. I heard words I'd heard dozens of times in court, spoken by relatives explaining strange signatures of elderly people, and silently slipped my hand into my pocket and pressed the record button on my phone. I allowed myself a longer pause than usual, pressed my fingers to my temples, as if trying to recall something specific, and failing. I asked quietly whether I really looked that confused. They rushed to reassure me, but not the way you reassure someone you love, rather the way you speak to someone whose forgetfulness you want documented. Jason said he was just worried, that if I suddenly forgot to pay something important or signed the wrong document, there could be problems. Allison gently confirmed that it was all out of concern for my well-being. I nodded, let them shape this image, while the phone in my pocket faithfully recorded every word. The next day, they went further. Over lunch, Allison casually asked whether I remembered those papers we had supposedly signed a month earlier, the ones at the notary, so Jason could help me with finances. She said it in a tone that an ordinary person would hear as a household detail, but an investigator would recognize as an attempt to steer the conversation toward a forged power of attorney. I answered honestly that I didn't remember any notary a month ago, that the only recent visits I'd made to Shannon Wheeler's office were for my own matters. Allison immediately soothed me, saying it was nothing to worry about, that people my age often lose entire days from memory, that back then I'd been tired and nervous, and of course I'd signed everything. Surely she wouldn't deceive me. I pretended to breathe out in relief, to take her at her word, even mumbled that I probably really couldn't keep straight anymore, which papers I'd signed and which I hadn't. Jason visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping. Like a schoolboy who'd been given the answer during a test, he said the important thing was that I was calm now and that they would take care of me. That evening, I overheard them in their room, clearly not expecting anyone to be standing outside the door, discussing how I didn't remember anything, how that was actually for the best. If I started protesting, they could always point to my age and confusion. I stood in the dim hallway, leaning against the wall. The phone in my hand quietly recorded every word again. That night, back in the study, I listened to both recordings through headphones and sent them to Karen via the secure channel she'd given me. In the subject line, I wrote exactly what mattered. that this was proof of how close relatives were already agreeing on a defense strategy in case the forgery came to light. After a while, her reply came, dry, professional, thanking me for the materials. She wrote plainly that these recordings would clearly show the court that they weren't mistaken, but were consciously preparing to cover up a forgery by referring to my supposed mental decline, and added that now we could go to the deal fully prepared. The days leading up to the deal, I played the role they had invented for me. I let myself mix up times, ask the same question twice, search longer for glasses that were lying in plain sight, asked Allison to repeat things as if I hadn't heard. Accepting this was hard, but every small performance made them more confident in their myth about the old man, and that meant their shock would be that much stronger when, at the right moment, I stood in front of them fully composed and absolutely clear-headed. The morning of the deal is etched in my memory down to the smallest detail. I woke up before the alarm, sat on the bed in the half-dark, and listened to the house the way I once listened to footsteps in a courthouse hallway before a verdict. From the kitchen came the smell of coffee. I could hear Allison clattering with dishes. The children were staying with her mother, so the house was unusually quiet. I put on my best suit, the same dark blue one, tied my tie in a neat knot, chose the shoes I always wore to the most important hearings. I took the briefcase with neatly arranged folders inside, the notarized statement, the copy of the registration ban, excerpts from the law, photographs, printouts, recordings. Everything organized with colored tabs, like a proper case file. Coming down to the kitchen, I said I wanted to run some errands, check an old deposit, maybe see a doctor, choose new blood pressure pills. I said it vaguely, so they would be left with the impression that I myself didn't really know where I was going. They listened only half-heartedly, partly because their minds were on the upcoming deal. Jason in a light shirt and a strict suit he never wore casually. Allison with a neat hairstyle and subtle but carefully thought-out makeup, wearing a blouse I'd only seen on holidays before. They were dressed the way people dress not for a house's funeral, but for its sale at a high price. I noticed it, registered it, and after wishing them a calm day, I left, feeling their eyes on my back. The office handling the transaction was in a modern glass building on one of the main highways. Second floor, a long corridor I had once walked as part of court delegations. Now Karen and I walked in together, step for step. She with her briefcase, me in my old suit that somehow smelled not only of mothballs, but of everything I'd had to gather into a fist from my past. Through the glass door of the conference room, I could see that everyone was already there. At the long oval table sat Leonard Hannigan, neat folders laid out in front of him. Beside him was a man in his early 50s, fit, wearing an expensive but understated suit. That was Robert Mullen, the out-of-town buyer. Across from them sat Jason and Allison. She, as always, looked confident. My son appeared tense but generally satisfied, like someone who believed the hardest part was behind him. In the corner, behind a laptop, sat a woman from the transaction support department. Her name was Sandra Parker. She was clearly responsible for registry checks and making sure all the paperwork was in order. I glanced at my watch. The hands showed the exact time the deal was supposed to begin. Karen nodded at me, asking with her eyes whether I was ready. I answered with a short nod, the same one I'd used many times to open a court session. We entered the conference room without knocking. The door slid open quietly. The conversations at the table stopped at once, several pairs of eyes lifting toward us simultaneously. For the first few seconds, the silence was dense, almost physical. Jason went pale as if all the blood had drained from him at once. Allison tensed, but kept her face under control, leaving only a light mask of surprise. Leonard frowned, trying to remember whether he had ever seen me in this context before. Robert Mullen leaned back in his chair with irritation, like a man being distracted from something important. Sandra shifted her gaze from me to Karen, already understanding from our expressions that this was not a simple, "oh sorry, wrong room" situation. I walked to the empty end of the table and placed my briefcase down so the click of the lock sounded clearly. In a calm voice, trained by years in court, I said that my name was Xian, and that I was the sole owner of the house they were about to sell today under a power of attorney supposedly issued by me. Jason jumped up immediately and began speaking in a rush, saying, "Dad, everything's fine here. We're just trying to make things easier for you, to take the burden off your shoulders." Allison supported him, saying in a sweet voice that I must have simply gotten confused and decided I hadn't signed anything for them. I raised my hand to stop them and addressed not them, but Sandra, as the representative of the company handling the transaction. I said that I had in my possession a notarized statement made in advance, several weeks before the date of that supposed power of attorney, in which I clearly and under oath stated that I had granted no authority to anyone to dispose of my house. I took the document out of the folder and slid it across the table to her so she could see the seal, the date, and the signature. At the same moment, Karen pulled out another folder containing a copy of the prohibition on any registration actions involving the house without my personal presence, and handed it to Sandra as well, explaining that this restriction was already recorded with the registration authority. As she read, Sandra's frown deepened. She then looked up at Leonard and asked whether he had checked for such restrictions before preparing the deal. He visibly faltered, muttered that he hadn't seen anything in the standard database and that he had relied on the power of attorney, which, in his opinion, looked flawless. I asked for permission to show everyone one more thing. I took out a printed copy of the power of attorney that had been in Jason's possession and placed it next to my genuine signature from the recent will. Calmly, I explained where the loop in the forged signature differed, where the pen pressure didn't match how I always sign. I spoke like an expert, not like a victim. Allison tried to steer the conversation back into familiar territory, claiming that I'd been forgetting things a lot lately, that I could have signed the document and then erased it from my memory, that they had no bad intentions and were acting on my instructions, and that now my memory was simply failing. I didn't argue with her in words. Instead, I turned on one of the recordings from my phone, placed it on the table so everyone could hear, and let it play. Allison's voice filled the room, the same familiar voice, with the intonations they liked to pass off as caring, but the words were very different. In a calm tone, she explained to Jason that if I started protesting the deal, they could always talk about age-related confusion, that I had signed the power of attorney, but now simply didn't remember. We listened to a few of her phrases. Then I stopped the recording and asked, with a hint of icy dryness in my voice, whether this sounded more like honest concern for an old man or like a prearranged cover story. Robert knitted his brows, looking from them to me, then turned to Leonard and asked what kind of circus this was and why he was being dragged into something like this. Sandra, no longer hiding her seriousness, said that under these circumstances she was obligated to immediately suspend the deal and report the possible fraud to management and, if necessary, to law enforcement. I took out another folder and spread across the table photographs of the pried open lock, the opened envelopes, and images from the nighttime meeting in my house with timestamps. Frames showing Jason and Allison raising glasses at my table, celebrating what they believed to be a successful forgery. Next to them, I placed printouts of Allison's correspondence with Chris, where it was plainly written that she would leave for him as soon as she received her share after the sale, and that Jason had no idea about her real plans. The words she herself had written in the heat of the moment now spoke against her far louder than any accusation of mine could. Leonard sat with his eyes lowered, studying the papers. His face showed something I had seen many times in professionals dragged into someone else's mess, a mix of shame and fear for his reputation. He quietly told Robert that under these circumstances, there could be no clean deal here, and that he himself would demand an internal review. Robert curtly said he had no intention of getting further involved, stood up, and began gathering his copies of the documents. Jason tried to babble something, turning first to me, then to Robert, insisting that everything could be explained, that it was a misunderstanding, that I had simply misinterpreted his concern. But his words sounded emptier and emptier against the backdrop of real, tangible evidence laid out in front of everyone. Allison, realizing that her former caring tone no longer worked, snapped into a thin scream and began accusing me of ruining my own son's life, saying I could have forgiven everything since I had planned to leave him the house anyway. I looked at her and said evenly, without raising my voice, that I had planned to leave the house to my son on one condition: that he keep his conscience, not sell it for a dream of easy money and another woman. At that moment, even Robert, who was already standing by the door, turned back and held his gaze on us, like a man who had just seen another side of human nature, far uglier than any legal term. Sandra, having finished reviewing the documents, stood up and formally announced that the deal was terminated, that the registry already contained a restriction requiring my personal participation, and that even if someone brought in a stack of papers with the most beautiful seals, registration would be impossible. She added that she was required to file an internal report about the attempt to conduct a transaction using clearly disputed documents and forward it to the appropriate authorities. Karen stood beside me, gathered our folders back together, leaving copies where required, and quietly asked whether I was ready to go further, to the police department to file an official complaint. I looked at Jason, who no longer sat as proudly as he had when he arrived. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes darted around, yet he still tried to catch my gaze, searching my face for even a shadow of the old paternal leniency. I looked at Allison, gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and understood that the moment for regret had passed long ago. I said yes, I was ready, because it was right here, in this conference room, that I had fully seen how far they were willing to go. I thanked Sandra and Leonard once more for not turning a blind eye, at least at this stage, then turned and walked out into the corridor with Karen, feeling the muffled voices behind me, the sound of chairs being moved, and someone else's dull irritation. Ahead was the police department, where for the first time in my life I would enter not as part of the system, but as a man whose own son had tried to take his house using forged documents. At the duty desk, there was that familiar feeling of a stuffy queue, the smell of paper, cheap coffee, and someone's sharp cologne. Only this time, I was sitting on a chair, not as a man from the system checking on a case, but as a victim whose own son had tried to steal his house with fake paperwork. Karen sat beside me, flipping through the folder, checking that all the documents were in place. Time passed slowly, but I didn't rush it. I knew too well that in places like this, haste only gets in the way. We were invited into the investigator's office. A woman in her 40s, solid build, short haircut, clear eyes, introduced herself as a senior investigator. I remembered her last name immediately, Klein. She offered us seats and asked what we had come in with, without unnecessary smiles or false sympathy, the way people speak when they are used to hearing unpleasant stories. Karen briefly outlined the essence of the matter: an attempted sale of a house using a forged power of attorney, with the owner alive, competent, and having signed no such document. I placed my documents on the table, the notarized statement, photographs, printed correspondence, and recordings of conversations. Klein first went through the papers in silence, occasionally clarifying dates and asking where exactly certain photos had been taken. Then she asked to play the recordings. In her narrow office, the voices of Jason and Allison filled the air, their calm discussion of my forgetfulness, their plan to blame my age and mental confusion if the forged power of attorney ever surfaced. The investigator listened without interrupting, only making notes in her notebook from time to time. When the recording ended, she leaned back in her chair and asked whether I was ready to officially state that all of this had been done behind my back and without my consent. I nodded and said that was exactly why I had come, that I understood what I was asking for, that this was not just a family quarrel, but an attempted real estate scam, and that yes, I fully realized against whom I would be testifying. For a while, Klein simply looked at me, weighing whether I might break halfway through, whether I might withdraw the statement. Then, apparently deciding I wouldn't, she began the formal process. Slowly, thoroughly, using wording I knew well, about signs of a crime, about forgery of a signature, about attempted large-scale fraud. I answered her questions like any other complainant, sticking to the facts, keeping emotions in check, even though inside it felt as if each answer was nailing shut the lid on my old family life. What followed went exactly as I had expected, and yet it still hurt. A few days later, Jason and Allison were summoned for questioning, first separately, then within the same case. Later, the investigator briefly told me how it had gone. Jason broke down fairly quickly. At first, he tried to say he believed the power of attorney was legal, that someone had simply handed him a ready-made document. But under the weight of the photos, recordings, correspondence, and direct questions about the broken cabinet lock, he admitted that he knew he was signing something different from what he had told me, that this way it would be faster to formalize everything in his name, and that yes, he wanted to speed up receiving what would eventually come to him anyway. Allison held out longer. She denied knowing about the forged signature and claimed she believed I myself had asked for the power of attorney to be prepared and then simply forgot. When investigators showed her the printouts of her correspondence with Chris, where she openly wrote that she planned to leave Jason for him as soon as the house was sold and she received her share, she tried to shift the blame onto that friend, saying he had encouraged her, convinced her it was possible, that nothing terrible would happen. But investigators had long since stopped believing stories like that. They calmly stated that regardless of who was on the other end of the messages, it was Allison who had attempted to use the power of attorney for my house. It was she who carried the folder from room to room, invited the realtor, sat at the table handing him the documents. At the same time, Karen filed a civil lawsuit demanding that the power of attorney be declared void, the preliminary sales agreement invalid, and the actions of Jason and Allison malicious. She also sought compensation for moral damages and reimbursement of the costs I had incurred to protect my property. The court may have seen similar cases, but in all my years on the bench, I had never encountered one like this in my own presence. Now I sat in the plaintiff's seat, giving testimony for the record. How I noticed the shifted folders, how I saw the scratches on the lock, how Tara recorded their every move in her notebook. Tara came to court as promised, wearing her light cardigan, that same notebook in her hands. Her voice trembled slightly but remained steady. She calmly described how an unfamiliar man with a briefcase had come to my house on Tuesday and Thursday, how Allison photographed the rooms, how at night the three of them sat at my table and then clinked glasses. The judge, a young woman with a firm gaze, listened, asked clarifying questions, then studied the printed emails for a long time, messages in which Allison referred to my house as our launch pad, from which she planned to leave for another life. In the end, the civil court ruled exactly what Karen and I had been working toward. The power of attorney was declared invalid from the moment it appeared, the preliminary agreement null and void, and the house sale deemed not to have taken place due to the fault of Jason and Allison. Separately, the court stated that my rights as an owner had been violated by the gross actions of close relatives and awarded me compensation for moral harm as well as reimbursement of legal expenses. The amounts were not astronomical, but they were significant for them, several tens of thousands of dollars, including costs. And the meaning of that sum was not so much financial as symbolic. You are guilty, and this has been officially recorded. The issue of eviction was considered in a separate proceeding. When I first saw the wording on paper, the defendants are obliged to vacate the residential premises, I felt cold inside. No matter how angry I was, there was still the feeling that I was throwing my own son out. But the next thought came slowly and inevitably. It was he who first chose a path that ended with a court bailiff and a stamp, not a family conversation at the kitchen table. Sometime after the ruling, I stood by the window of my study and watched a moving truck pull up to the gate, watched workers in uniforms carry Jason and Allison's belongings out of the house. They loaded boxes, clothes, electronics, furniture they had bought for themselves. Before my eyes, the life they had tried to build inside my home without asking me was leaving, piece by piece. At one point, Jason left the workers, walked up the steps, and rang the doorbell. I opened it. He stood there, looking both younger and older at the same time, desperation in his eyes mixed with a familiar attempt to manipulate. "Dad," he said, "give us one more chance. We were stupid, we made mistakes, but we're family." I looked at him and saw not only the son I once carried on my shoulders, but a man who had deliberately broken into my cabinet, forged my signature, discussed with his wife how to have me declared incompetent. I quietly told him that he had his chance when he could have come to me honestly, said he was struggling, in debt, overwhelmed. Then yes, we could have looked for a solution together. But when he chose to go around me through notary stamps and other people's hands, he himself crossed the line where family ends and a criminal case begins. He tried to take my hand. I gently pulled mine away, said that from this day on, only I lived in this house, and softly but firmly closed the door in front of him. I changed the locks that same day, not because I feared a nighttime visit, but because I needed to put a full stop for myself. That evening, I sat alone in the kitchen, listening to water drip steadily from a poorly tightened faucet, and understood that a criminal trial still lay ahead, interrogations, expert examinations, and most of all the day when, for the first time in my life, I would enter a courtroom not through the corridor reserved for judges, but through the common door, sit not on the raised bench, but on the seats for participants. That day came toward the end of summer. The hallway of the district courthouse smelled of fresh paint or linoleum. People sat on benches holding folders, some whispered, some sat in silence. I waited my turn, staring at walls I knew painfully well. Over the years, I had known almost every corner of this building, and now I felt like a stranger here. When we were called into the courtroom, I entered and saw Jason and Allison at the defendants' tables, on opposite sides, each with their own lawyer. Their faces were gray with exhaustion and nerves, and still nothing stirred inside me, because I remembered too clearly their glasses raised at my table and their whispers about my failing memory. The judge, a middle-aged man with a hard, clear gaze, opened the session dryly, without unnecessary introductions. The prosecutor read out the charges: attempted real estate fraud, forgery of a signature, actions committed against an elderly relative. Had the crime succeeded, it would have amounted to an especially large-scale offense. I listened to this text the way I had once listened to hundreds of indictments, only now every word concerned my life, my home, my name, mentioned as the victim. I was called to testify. I stepped into the center of the courtroom, placed my hand on the railing, and calmly, without theatrics, recounted everything in the order it had happened. From the first strange feeling in my study because of the shifted folders, to the night surveillance, to the red folder on the table, to the power of attorney bearing someone else's hand instead of mine, to the recorded conversations in which they had already discussed how they would blame my supposed senility. I spoke in the same voice with which I once addressed juries, but now I was speaking to a judge, and perhaps it was that habit that helped me hold myself together. Then Tara took the stand. It wasn't easy for her. The courtroom was hot, the people unfamiliar, but she still calmly described what she had seen through her windows, how the realtor came, how the lights were on in my house late at night, how the three of them sat at the table, how glasses clinked afterward, how on the day of the deal, Jason and Allison's car stopped at the gate, and how they returned from there changed, their shoulders slightly straighter, as if they already considered the house fully theirs. The judge asked questions, and she answered without getting confused, naming days of the week, approximate times, everything needed for the record, and later, for a verdict. When it was their turn, Jason spoke quietly, sometimes stumbling. At moments, he admitted guilt, then tried to soften his role, saying the initiative mainly came from Allison, that he had simply gone along. He said he loved me, that he hadn't wanted me harm, that he thought he was only speeding up something that would have happened eventually anyway. Allison held her line to the end, insisting she believed the power of attorney was legal, that she had no idea about any forgery, that her messages with Chris were just emotions, that she had no intention of leaving Jason. When asked why her emails said the opposite, she answered vaguely, looking more at the table than at the judge. The verdict wasn't announced immediately, but we weren't made to wait forever. Still, those minutes dragged on for me like a thick, sweltering August day. When the judge returned to the courtroom, everyone stood. He began reading in a flat, businesslike tone. I caught only fragments. Find guilty, attempted fraud, taking into account that the crime was not completed, and so on. In the end, Jason received a suspended sentence of about 1.5 years, with mandatory community service hours and an obligation to pay me a certain amount in compensation. Allison received a harsher sentence, a longer suspended term, more community service hours, a substantial fine, and a ban on working in the real estate field for several years. I listened calmly, without any sense of triumph. What mattered to me wasn't how many months or years they would spend under supervision, but the fact that the court officially recognized that they were guilty, that this wasn't my old age imagination or a family dispute, but a real crime that simply hadn't been carried through. When the judge finished and tapped the table, I stood and left the courtroom just as calmly, without looking at either my son or his former wife. Outside, by the corridor window, Tara was already waiting for me, small in her light cardigan. She looked at me and said only one thing, that justice does sometimes reach its destination, especially when someone helps push it along. We went outside. We stopped on the courthouse steps. The sun hit our eyes. People hurried past on their own errands. For them, it was just another building. For me, it was a part of life I was leaving behind. Tara asked what I planned to do next, now that the house was protected and the verdict delivered. I was quiet for a moment, listening to the calm spreading inside me, and said that it would probably be too simple to just shut myself inside 4 walls and call myself a winner. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like someone who had once managed to see a case through to the end, and who now probably ought to help others avoid being pushed that far. That was how an idea was born, one I had never considered before. I spoke with Karen, with Klein, with lawyer acquaintances, and suggested offering free consultations for seniors in our area, explaining how to protect their property, which papers not to sign, how to place restrictions with the registry, how to check powers of attorney, how not to let children or grandchildren turn them into silent extras in their own lives. I was invited to the local senior support center. I began going there a couple of times a week, sat at a table, laid out simple handouts, and in my usual manner, without drama, explained how this part of the law works, not for judges, but for people who come in with trembling hands and fear in their eyes. By then, my house was living a different, quieter life. I changed the locks, put my study in order, cleared out everything from the guest room that reminded me of Jason's temporary office. I hung old photographs back on the walls and put some newer ones into a drawer, not because I wanted to erase my son, but because I wasn't ready to stumble over those faces every day. In the evenings, I brewed coffee, went out onto the porch, listened to the trees crackle, to dogs barking somewhere beyond the fence. Sometimes I saw Tara walking by, waved to her, and she waved back. Sometimes she came in for tea, and we sat together in silence, 2 older people who no longer need many words. The pain of my son crossing that line never went away. It simply stopped being an open wound and became an old scar, one you don't touch every day, but sometimes brush against and feel a sting. I didn't play the game of forgive and forget, because I knew that forgiving something like this would mean agreeing to be a convenient victim. I had spent too many years defending other people's rights to give up my own voluntarily. I don't know what will happen to Jason years from now, whether he'll understand what he did, whether he'll change, whether he'll try to see me again. But I know one thing. He will cross the threshold of this house only as someone who has acknowledged his actions, not as a resentful child, angry that something belonging to someone else was taken away. Sometimes I think back to that night when Tara and I sat in the empty house across the street, waiting for the realtor's car. I remember the lights in the windows, the red folder on the table, the gleam of the glasses. And every time, I catch myself thinking that it was right then, not in court and not at the police station, that I made the most important choice, not to look away, not to blame everything on age, not to sign yet another paper for the sake of peace, but to stand up and, even with shaking hands, piece together my own defense. That choice wasn't about the law, it was about self-respect. Now, when I tell this story, I don't do it to seek pity or feed anyone's appetite for drama. I do it because I know how easily someone who has lived a long life can end up in a position where relatives start seeing your home and your mind as shared property. I didn't become that property. And if what happened to me helps even one person become alert in time, look through their papers, add one extra signature at the registry, or see a lawyer before it's too late, then none of this was in vain. My house still stands where it always did, the same walls, just new locks. And every time I turn the key, I hear that clean, clear click and understand that it's not just about metal in a door. It's about the fact that I am still the owner of my own life, with all its losses, but also with that straight inner spine that you don't give up to anyone, for any amount of money and for no suspended sentence. If you like this story, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching, or